So what will we be covering today? So we work with many organisations on a whole range of security solutions day to day, but today we'll be focusing on phishing and the impacts it can have. We'll also be talking to you about some solutions to mitigate the risk. You'll see that our website and email address is on the slides. If you think there's anything we could help you with following the webinar, feel free to get in touch and we can discuss options with you. First though, I want to understand what you want from today, so we're going to do a quick poll. Now, in the joining instructions, we ask for you to connect to the VVox session, which I think most of you have, and this will enable us to show you the questions and submit answers as we go along. We'll direct you to it when we need you to go there, but if you didn't manage to do it before and you have joined the call, then you can do it from the instructions here. So what would you like to walk away with today? Have a look at that. Super. So the poll is closed. Excellent. Okay. Right, some interesting results there. So we'll keep that in the background, and thank you for doing that. We'll revisit this at the end. So let's get started. What types of phishing are there then? So we refer to phishing as one big thing, but there are various types which are aimed at certain groups or have certain goals. These are the top three that are most known. The first icon, phishing, we call this wide net phishing and is the most common. You have probably seen it many times. It's when there's a lot of emails sent to a large group of individuals from various places in the hope that some of the victims will click the link or enter their credentials because they think it's genuine. Although this is the most common and generally people know that it happens, a lot of employees don't know how to recognise the difference between a real and a fake email. We'll cover this later in the webinar in a bit more detail. Then we have spear phishing and whaling. These target a specific group of individuals but at different levels in the business. Executive assistants or administrators may be targets for spear phishing, whereas C-level execs would be targeted with a whaling attack. It's quite easy to reach a person using their finance app or guessing the email naming convention from the About Us or staff pages on a website, so it may not be as hard to obtain these as people may think. So that's the types of phishing. Let's look at the techniques. So each of the types that we've just looked at can all be delivered via email, and this is what we most commonly see. But these attacks can be delivered through other methods that are not maybe quite so obvious, meaning that the chance of being caught out increases. Now, looking at this slide here, we're going to do another little poll very quickly. So if you just jump onto VVox and we'll start the poll. Interesting. Okay, so the way in which hackers try to get credentials or spread malware has branched out into many forms. Hackers are the best at moving with the times and have methods in place to cover all forms of communications. So let's have a quick look at these then, and then you can check your knowledge if you said that you've heard of them on the poll. So spoofing is the act of disguising a communication from an unknown source as being from a known, trusted source. Spoofing can apply to emails, phone calls, websites, or it can be more technical like spoofing an IP address or a DNS server. Pharming is a malicious website that resembles a legitimate one. Many criminals will do a lot of work to become the top result in search engines in order to lure their victims to the page and trick them into entering usernames and passwords. With both smishing and vishing, which isn't the easiest thing to say, telephones replace emails as a method of communication. Smishing involves criminals sending text messages. The content is pretty much the same as with an email, and vishing involves a telephone conversation instead. Now, angler phishing, I think this one had quite a low result on the poll here. It's a relatively new attack vector. Social media offers several ways for criminals to trick people. Fake URLs, cloned websites, posts, tweets, instant messaging, which is essentially the same as smishing, can all be used to persuade people to divulge sensitive information or download malware. And then we have watering hole phishing attacks, which I think was the lowest on the poll there for what people have seen before. This one has a bit more to it. Hackers will identify specific websites that a company or its employees visit most often and infect one or several of those sites with malware. Now, once this is done, the hackers just lay in wait like a crocodile at a watering hole, and all they have to do is wait for somebody to visit the site, and then malware can be distributed, infecting the company and spreading across the entire estate. So now we've covered the basics, I'm going to hand over to Barry, the technical director, who will take you deeper into the world of phishing.
Thanks, Janine. So building on what we've already learned about in the techniques, we're going to work through an example of a pretty decent phishing email received recently and compare it alongside a genuine email. So we'll go through a few things that we can help our colleagues understand as key things to look for in emails to ensure they're genuine, but also to look at some of the protections that we can put in place to technically prevent phishing campaigns from succeeding. So on the left, we can see an email from an NHS COVID test result. This is legitimately from the NHS, and you can see that they've included a few pieces of information which help to identify the legitimacy of it. On the right is an email which isn't quite so legitimate. It was sent to a very old email address, which is still associated as an alias of the same email account. But notice the text, the layout, the spacing, and even the logo sizing. This is an example of a decent phishing email, as some effort has really gone into researching what a legitimate email looks like and then building on that. So other than the absence of that specific information, how else can we identify that this is a phishing email? Let's take a little bit of a closer look. So when considering the key indicators, as already previously discussed, this isn't the worst phishing email we've seen, which is why we're looking at this one, because it's quite good to show the level of sophistication that your colleagues may have to contend with. There are 4 key things that we can look for initially without even having to interact with anything in the mail itself. The email address, which has sent the mail. This can be harder to spot issues depending on the client that the email is being read from, but in Outlook on the desktop, it's quite obvious to see that this has come from a Hotmail address, obviously not the way that NHS normally send their emails. The next part, which is again easier on some mail clients than others, is the name of the email. So on a mobile client, they don't often have enough screen real estate to be able to show the name and the email address, and so the name will often be prioritized. The phishing mail in this case has taken advantage of that by putting a legitimate looking address in the name line so that some mail clients, people may believe that this has come from a legitimate address since that's all they can see. If you click on the name on when you're using a mobile client though, you'll be able to often see some more information, and we'll come on to that on the next slide. The subtleties of the text spacing, sizing, and use of formatting in an email can also give cause to question the legitimacy of the sender. So specifically in this case, the things that we can see which might seem uncharacteristic are there's actually no indents above the bullet points for the 2 links that they want me to click. So ironically, there was one bullet point above, but you can see how the 2 links that contain the target to the phishing site that it's trying to take us to don't actually have that indent. Text sizing as well has also dropped from 14.5 to 11, although the font that was used for that, Helvetica, was consistent throughout the email. And text spacing from the bullet points is also not consistent with the rest of the email. And finally, the last paragraph has absolutely abysmal grammar, and it doesn't really match the on-point grammar and language that we tend to expect from our official gov.uk services. So again, looking out for tiny little things like this in email can really help to differentiate between a legitimate and a phishing email. So again, just to follow on from that, on a mobile device, this is the same email viewed on a mobile device, and we can have a look to see how some of the spacing guidance that I just gave on the previous slide doesn't necessarily translate as well on mobile clients, because they simplify and harmonize the formatting to ensure a better experience for the smaller screen. However, if you click on the office at nhs.gov.uk address, it shows us a menu to be able to add the sender to contacts and also exposes their actual email address. Similarly, clicking and holding, but not just tapping, please don't just tap, like click and hold the URLs in the email, expose the actual destination. Outlook.com comes with built-in protection and replaces links in emails with ones which go via their screening service first. So you might be able to see that there where it goes to safelinks.protection.outlook.com. This doesn't necessarily guarantee that the link will have been evaluated, but like everything in security, we put in as many layers as possible to give us defense in depth. So one of the most common things that we hear from people a lot in both our personal and professional lives in the context of security is, well, I don't have anything important, so I don't really see why it makes a difference if someone gets into my email. Let me be clear. This statement as a security professional scares me a lot. Not just for the sake of the individual, but we also need to question whether this is isolated to their one Yahoo personal email account secured with last year's most commonly used password, used by 2.5 million people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But no, it tends to be more than that. The real issue is poor cyber practices, personally, or cyber hygiene, as we sometimes call it, that inevitably spills into that person's work life. And the abilities of hacker groups to pivot from an email account to so many other areas are often underestimated. So this graphic here illustrates just how far a hacked email account can take someone. Ultimately, if you own a person's email account, you can reset passwords to virtually every other account which uses that email address, systematically taking over their digital persona. Some services may require more than just a simple forgot my password field to be filled out before sending an email reset link to the compromised email address. But many of those types of services with a more sophisticated password reset option are less common than we would like. What the idea of showing this is not to have an overwhelming slide for you, but really to show the capabilities of hackers to be able to pivot into a number of different areas of the person's digital life just by having the email. So the key message to take away is do not underestimate the impact of an email account getting hacked or of people's poor personal cyber hygiene, as it can cost your organization dearly. So as we just saw, the impact of an attack can be significant as an attacker pivots into other services, from something like a phishing email campaign or something that comes from text messaging as well. With this in mind, I'm going to walk you through a scenario that really happened to get a better understanding of what could happen when employees are not given any training. So it's worth mentioning, just before we get started on this, that this is not for show, but this was on the back of a real investigation that we were asked to conduct. We had a client, Company A, we're going to call them, who was a multinational organization with a fairly small number of employees who didn't use technology strategically and saw it only as something to do email and report writing. Emails from the business were allowed, employees from the business were allowed to use the company devices as their own. And whilst the security recommendations were generally implemented, this would only ever be driven by things which were considered to not cause the staff to have to learn anything new or to adjust their working practices. Company A's customer, Company B, worked together with them for a number of years and exchanged invoices and payments on a regular basis. The victim of the attack, who we've called Jeff, looked after various operations for Company A. He had limited knowledge of technology security and was never given any awareness training to help him understand things such as password security, phishing techniques, and what he could do to protect himself and the company when he was being safe online. Unfortunately, Jeff was not very good at remembering passwords, and so for ease, he used the same short password for all of his accounts. What Jeff did not realize, however, is that this made him the perfect target, as hackers would only need to get his password once, and suddenly all of his accounts were fair game. As you can guess, Jeff's credentials were obtained. When we were asked how did this happen, we weren't actually able to determine whether it was via a phishing email or one of his personal accounts had been compromised, potentially in a breach, allowing hackers to use a technique called credential stuffing to get into his work account. So credential stuffing, for those of you who've never heard it before, is where attackers will try combinations of passwords and emails together to see if the user's password may fit with another address. Regardless of the password combination that got leaked, using one password for all accounts makes a victim more susceptible to this kind of attack. After his credentials for one system were obtained, the hackers broke into his email account and set up rules for all emails containing words like invoice, orders, payment, and they redirected all of those into the RSS feeds folder. Cleverly did it on server-side rules so that they didn't actually have to do anything client-side on Jeff's machine. It was all done by signing into the Outlook web access. They continued to gather information and set up more tools, such as a fake domain, and then collected details of an upcoming invoice sent to the finance team at Company B. Following a legitimate dealing with Jeff, Company B were poised to make the payment, but then received another email from Jeff talking about the unprecedented times and that the payment needed to be directed to another account. It came from Jeff's email and appeared to include another employee from the finance team. However, it wasn't really her account. It was just one that had been made using the same formatting of the address, and they had used this fake domain that they had bought that basically looked exactly the same but just contained an extra S in it. Every step was carefully orchestrated and the cleanup was happening along the way, so none of the evidence was in plain sight. The money was paid into the account without question because, from Company B's perspective, the email had come from Jeff, right? Jeff was later looking for an email and realized that there was some missing, which was when we were later called in to help. However, by the time we discovered what had been done, it was too late and the money had gone. Earlier engagement to upskill their employees and implement stronger security controls, despite the initial pain it might have caused the users, could have prevented that loss. And naturally, there are lots of things that Jeff could have done differently, and hindsight is marvelous. However, to avoid making the same mistakes, there are some things that Jeff ought to have done. An earlier contact with us might have helped to enable us to have conversations about additional controls which could have been implemented. The key, of course, being earlier, because having flagged this so late in the attack meant that we were at best only able to prevent further damage and assist with the disclosure to their client and the authorities. The other controls would definitely have helped, and many of you will have already realized that these kind of controls might be important, as otherwise you probably wouldn't have attended this webinar. However, of course, everything we've listed above, of all of them, the one control that we want to say would almost certainly have helped to prevent this attack would be multi-factor authentication, and here's why. So ultimately, a strong password plus multi-factor authentication equals a secure login. But you might be asking, why is it necessary, and why is a great password not good enough anymore? So a strong password by itself is only useful to prevent against brute force attacks, i.e. that's where automated system is directed at a login service and it keeps trying passwords until something finally works. That could either be from password lists or just trying different combinations of letters and numbers. However, regardless if you're using the same password for everything, regardless of how strong it is, that password will be rendered useless as soon as one of the sites that you're using it on has been breached. And passwords involved in breaches then end up on password lists, which companies like us use during penetration attacks, as they're a great source of real passwords to try and a brute force attack on a system being tested. However, when enabling MFA on systems, we move away from the password being the only thing required to validate that the login attempt is legitimate. So what does MFA actually include? What makes up multi-factor authentication? So multi-factor authentication is when we're securing something, we ultimately want to be able to validate that it is the person who is legitimately supposed to be getting in there by using more than one method or factor to do so. So when we consider multi-factor authentication, our ideal scenario would be to have a system which leverages as many factors as possible. So MFA therefore equals something you have, like a backup or a second device with an authenticator app or a physical hardware security key, something you know, such as passwords, a security question or PIN numbers, and then something you are. So think biometrics such as face recognition or fingerprints. So the people in our businesses are by far the biggest risk, but can equally provide us a very powerful defense given the right training. Some attacks can be stopped by implementing firewalls and other technologies available through companies like us, but it won't catch all of them. So what's the answer for a complete solution? Employee engagement and awareness training through simulated campaigns is another way that we can help build security awareness in our teams. So PointWire offers a service to silently test the knowledge across teams and then close gaps to ensure a continued awareness is maintained. We can then provide reporting metrics and tailored training dependent on whether it's C-level execs that might need a deeper level of understanding about whaling attacks, or if we need to provide more sort of wider generalist type of training to the wider organization. In our experience here, though, an investment can save a whole lot later. So a couple of quick wins, though, that we couldn't recommend highly enough as really low-hanging fruits that you can take away from this presentation today and have a look in your own organizations to find out whether or not you've got these implemented, would be DNS and URL protection. So I'm going to go a bit further into what these two things actually are. So URL protection replaces the original URLs in an email with one which goes via another service to be vetted first. So reported or discovered phishing websites will then end up on deny lists for these services, meaning that even if your colleagues do accidentally click a link, the service will warn them that the link is unsafe and stop them from being able to go there without considerable effort. So they'll get something that looks a little bit like what you can see on the page there at the moment. So that's the Outlook one, and everybody knows that the color red is a big old warning. So we don't want to be clicking it. They're often free as part of cloud mail providers, and other paid for or enterprise solutions do exist to protect businesses with on-prem email services. So some examples of products that are available to do that are Microsoft Exchange Online Protection, Trend Micro Email Security, or even Mimecast. So several organizations block shortened URLs, but many employees don't actually know why it could be a security risk. And actually a number of security professionals as well don't always brand them as completely unsafe before they actually understand it. So one thing that I'm going to give you guys today that you may not have realized is that actually some shortened link services have a way of being able to validate the target of the URL, because shortening a URL can disguise the link as going to something that could be an illegitimate source. And then the problem is if you're clicking a link from an untrusted source, it's a real leap of faith as to whether or not it could result in some more serious consequences. So the origin of bit.ly links in particular can be checked by grabbing the link, pasting it into your address bar but not hitting enter, and then just adding a plus at the end of the original link, then hitting enter. So what that will do is it goes off to Bitly's site and it will show you the actual full link so that you can check whether or not it looks like it's something legitimate before you actually go there. So one of the other things that is just for a bit of fun is something that we're going to explore now on this slide. So validating URLs obviously can be extremely important because we've seen an example on the previous slide about how those services can do that. But even the targets themselves can, with different fonts, look like they're going to the same sites. So on this slide, we've got 3 examples of 3 different fonts, each showing a link which appears to go to paypal.com. But what I want you to do now is look really closely at the Rockwell ones, and you'll notice the tiny serifs on what looks like an L at first glance, but is actually an I at the end of the right PayPal link. So you should be able to see that that isn't actually PayPal, but PAYPAI. All 3 of the URLs on the right side actually are in fact using a capital I instead of a capital L. Instead of an L. And whilst our presentation's font of Rockwell is the most obvious, I think you'll agree that it is a very subtle difference, and Rockwell isn't a very commonly used font in general. The latter 2 fonts you will definitely recognize though, as Arial is very common in UK government documentation, and Calibri has been Microsoft's default font of choice in Office products since 2007, after everybody finally realized that Times New Roman was super dated. So that should give you quite a nice, easy visual way of seeing just how even we can be tricked into clicking links even when the target matches the text. So don't worry though, because the old guidance used to be, yeah, but provided the padlocks in the address bar, we're all good, right? Yeah, used to be the case, and not anymore, unfortunately. That padlock is afforded to sites that have an SSL certificate. So when they're using HTTPS rather than HTTP, they have an SSL certificate, which allows the browser to check that the name of the site that you're going to matches the name on the certificate, as well as encrypt the connection. These used to be only paid for certificates, and the effort to get them was more than what hacker groups wanted to put in many cases. In the quest to make encryption of our connections a de facto standard, however, free services such as Let's Encrypt allow anyone who owns a domain and can prove that ownership to Let's Encrypt can get a free HTTPS certificate for their website. This is great for those of us who want to provide encrypted website connections for free, but it's bad news in the sense that now even phishing websites can get a 3-month certificate without having to interact with another human, thereby providing that little padlock of what used to be a way of us saying, well, the site must be legitimate. So everything we've shown so far normally assumes that the text in the link is the same as the destination though. However, we could still read that the text or use the bit.ly link to check, couldn't we? Well, even then, no, not really, because we can also make the text of the URL say something different to the actual destination that it's going to take us to. And I know that there was some interest actually in creating a dodgy link. So we're going to go through a little exercise now to see how we can actually make some dodgy links. So this is a really nice, easy exercise. Everybody can have a go at this whilst we're all on the presentation together to see how easily the text can be changed to be different from the destination that the link actually goes to. So commonplace phishing campaigns will often put a valid looking address or URL text in the display text, but point the actual address to their phishing website. From what we've covered over the last few slides, you can see that there's a lot of work that goes into phishing emails sent out to fool us, and they get better all the time. If you'd like to have a crack at this yourselves, you can follow the instruction and make the dodgy link if you like alongside when I'm going to do it for the purposes of the webinar. If you just want to take a quick screenshot now, so if you're using a Windows machine, if you use Windows key plus Shift plus S, that will activate the snipping tool, and you'll be able to grab the instructions there and then open that up. If you're on a Mac, if you use Command Shift and then 4 on the keyboard, you'll be able to do the same thing where you can drag over the area. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to do that now. So what we're going to do is we're going to say https://pointwire.co.uk and enter, and then nicely Word helps me by making that into a URL. But what I can do is right click on that rather than left clicking on it and go edit hyperlink, and notice here that the text to display doesn't necessarily have to be the same as the address. I've got 2 separate fields. So what I can do on the text to display, I can change that to bbc.co.uk, click OK. And now what I've got is a link that says https bbc.co.uk. But if I hover over it, you'll see that the target is still going to take me to pointwire.co.uk. And if I hold Control and click to take me to that link, off I go to pointwire.co.uk, even though the link actually told me that I was going to go to BBC. So hopefully that's a little visual aid for everyone to see how easy it is and how straightforward of an exercise it is for us to be able to make a dodgy link in an email. So there is another control that I did say was a really, really low-hanging fruit one to be able to implement. And the nicest thing about this one is that actually this is something that is so straightforward to implement. It's such a quick win for all of us. It's called DNS Protection. So it's like URL protection, but at a slightly different level. So rather than the checking that the URL is valid by going to an external security service, DNS protection allows the DNS provider to throw up a warning page or not even resolve some sites that are suspected to have phishing or malware behind them. So for those of you who don't know what DNS is, think of it like an enormous telephone directory for the internet. So none of us know the IP addresses of the websites we want to visit on the top of our head, and I don't want to carry around a book of all the IP addresses for the whole internet. But we can, as humans, we're pretty good at remembering names like bbc.co.uk, google.com, and who doesn't love to Amazon Prime something from amazon.co.uk. DNS translates all of these names into IP addresses for us. And so having a good provider who polices whether some of these dodgy links should be listed even is like a security guard going through a phone book with a big black marker and striking out all the phone numbers for the known criminals and grifters, which is pretty awesome. And it's also, like in many cases, a free service. So we had this enabled on our network. And the interesting thing is that I set this months and months ago and completely forgot when I was going through and creating some of the slides for this presentation that we had it enabled. But the warning that you see on there was actually after clicking the link in the NHS email, and the warning that comes from Cloudflare's DNS service that we got presented with when we're actually deliberately trying to click that link so that we could show you some of the stuff for the website. So it shows how effective the DNS protection actually is. So you get that Outlook protection for the URL stuff as one control, and then even if you want to go beyond that, Cloudflare is still there going, whoa, hang on, are you sure you want to go there? A few examples of good services that can be considered are available from Cloudflare. Quad9 and Komodo Secure DNS is also another good service to have a look at. So we've looked at techniques, we've looked at impacts, and we looked at controls to prevent phishing, and hopefully everyone's taken something away from the presentation today. So just as one last parting gift from us though is to give you a site that you can check your own email addresses to find out whether or not one of your own accounts has been involved in a breach where your credentials might have been leaked onto the dark web. So the site is called Have I Been Pwned? It's a strange spelling, but pwned is a term that it's used by hackers to describe when somebody has been hacked. The site is free and it allows you to put in any email address and to see whether or not it might have been involved in a breach. With over 10.5 billion accounts that they've got listed, it's definitely worth a shot to see if yours appears on a list. So we're going to see how it works quickly here. So I'll just flick back to my browser. And then I can put in an email address, click the search, and then you can see that this email address has been involved in a number of different hits. So you can find out when the actual attack took place. So it will give you an idea as to what it was. And if you know that this was a period where perhaps you were using 1Password for those things and you know what that password might have been, this is a really good way of being able to see, okay, I need to go back and I need to change those passwords. So at this point, I'm going to hand back over to Janine to wrap up the session and take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Barry. So that concludes the webinar for today. Thank you for listening, and we hope that it has been useful and informative. So at the beginning, I asked you what you wanted to get out of the session today. So let's see what you actually did walk away with. So if we jump back on VVox and we'll run the last poll, please. Let's have a look. Excellent. So that's really good. So we've had a good little session there where people have got quite a bit from that, I can see. So that's excellent. And it was useful, which is what we wanted. So we now do have a little bit of time to take questions. So if you do have any questions, type them in the VVox and we'll get them answered now on the call.
We have actually had a question sent in by Mike, so thanks for sending that in, Mike. He asks, why am I receiving these sorts of emails and they're not going straight into my spam box?
Which is something I can answer. So I'm Dan from PointWire. So your spam box is mainly done by your email provider, your exchange provider, and it's a bit of a black box into why emails go to spam. So usually what happens is your mail provider, like Gmail, for example, or Outlook, they will use lists of bad sender IPs. They'll look to see if the email address has been, or the email header has been tampered with, which is commonly used for spoofing. And they also use like machine language learning to read the emails to see, they're essentially looking for keywords. Some common ones are free and cheap, look for emojis and that sort of stuff to see whether or not it trends in with other spam emails that users have reported. And there's also huge blacklists out there that they also refer to too. And unfortunately, like every system in IT, there are ways that people can bypass them. They change the language slightly. They use fresh IP addresses that haven't been deemed as spam before. So the best way is to take essentially what you've learned from here and apply it to all the emails that show up in your inbox, essentially. So to answer the question, in short, computers aren't perfect, and sometimes stuff slips through the net.
Thanks, Dan. We've also had a really good question come in from Stuart as well. Can you do the DNS protection on mobile devices?
So the DNS protection, what we can do is we can do it at the level of the router. In say in our home networks, you can in some routers you can actually change the DNS servers that are used. So rather than using your ISP's DNS servers, you can change it at the root, and that will then mean that all devices within your home network will use a service like Cloudflare. So Cloudflare have a number of different types of service. If some of you got children at home and you're looking also to protect against adult sites being able to be resolved, you can also use a version of their DNS protection service that will prevent malware and also filter out adult websites as well from even being able to be resolved, which can be quite useful. But coming back to Stuart's question on the mobile devices, absolutely, there are normally applications available to almost set up like a sort of VPN on the devices themselves. And as I say, the one that I have that I use periodically when VPNs are not working necessarily as solidly as I would hope on certain networks is an app called 1.1.1.1. It's the IP address of Cloudflare's DNS services, and you can download that. You click connect to it, and then what it will do is filter all of the DNS requests from your mobile device to go to Cloudflare's DNS servers rather than going via whichever connection you're on and using that connection's DNS. So yes, it is possible to do that.
Thanks for that, Barry. That's actually very, very interesting to know. And OpenDNS is also a good one on the back of that too, which I believe is provided by Cisco nowadays. And that does very similar to features. One thing that usually get asked as well is how often should you change your password? And it's widely discussed in the IT world, and it's highly debated. And to be honest, there's not really a correct answer to this question. However, we would advise, and the general consensus nowadays is if you use strong and unique passwords across all your accounts, actually changing your password on a weekly, monthly, or yearly routine doesn't actually give you that much added security, because the reason we use strong passwords is to protect against brute force. And if you have a strong password that essentially cannot be brute forced, changing the password makes it more of a hindrance to the user rather than gives you any more security benefits. However, if you do believe that your account has been compromised, you should certainly change your passwords ASAP.
We've also just had a little query come in from Alexandra as well. Is this DNS info that Barry's talking about the same as a VPN?
Similar, but differs slightly. So with a VPN is kind of like if I described you wanting to be able to get your own private channel when you're using the internet, so that everything between your device that you're connecting from VPN to the point where the VPN provider is, that entire channel is encrypted, meaning that your ISP cannot see the contents of the channel. There can't be any compromised machines along the way that would be able to look at the contents of the channel. But obviously at the other end, when the traffic does eventually have to get decrypted and come out of the VPN provider's exit point, it then becomes unencrypted. But it helps to allow for either you to appear from a different location to what you actually are, so that it makes it harder for advertisers to hoover up your data. But the DNS services that we've talked about, and DNS protection, can often be included within some VPN providers. So I believe that NordVPN, for example, bundles a possibility to use their secure DNS services rather than ones that you would use separately. DNS still uses the connection as is, so you don't get any encryption benefit from the device to its destination. So the traffic is still, it'll benefit if it's an HTTPS connection. It'll have obviously encryption using the HTTPS protocol, but the connection itself in its entirety is not encrypted. It means that you can get sometimes better performance, but it's even like a base level of protection. And there are nowadays in the security community anyway, there are questions over whether or not having VPNs on all the time really afford us the level of protection that the providers would have us all believe when they're trying to sell you their VPN services. So the good thing though is that DNS protection works regardless whether you are on or off a VPN, provided the connection that you're on. So in the case of your home connections, if you adjust those DNS settings in your router to use a secure DNS service, then you will get that benefit regardless of whether the devices are on VPN or not.
I think that's it for the questions, guys. I think everybody's asked everything they want to ask.
Fabulous. Well, that's really good. Thank you very much. We obviously did a good job on the webinar. So thank you all very much for joining. We will end it here and let you get back to your day. Thank you very much.